Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. You know, there's all kinds of myths and misconceptions about boa constrictors. Some of these are obviously not true, whereas others, even seasoned boa keepers, sometimes believe. Today I wanted to count down the top myths and misconceptions about boa constrictors and offer some honest perspective on these issues. If you like this video and you want to learn all about keeping and breeding boas in captivity, please be sure to subscribe to the Brian Boas YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of my upcoming boa videos. The first myth is that boa constrictors are giant snakes, and this is simply untrue. In fact, this myth is so prevalent that the term boa constrictor has become synonymous with any species of giant snake, including anacondas and pythons. I would say that boa constrictors are really medium to large snakes, with a few getting into the extra large range. So if we look at the boa constrictors as a whole, the average sizes of adults are anywhere from about 3 to about 10 feet. And if we look at the semi-dwarf and dwarf boas of Central America and the island boas, these typically are in the 4 to 6 foot range, including the Hog Island, the Qualquay, Tarahumara, etc. And then if we look at the larger types of locality boas, adults are typically in the 6 to 9 foot range, and this includes most of the true red tails as well as the Argentine Boa. They're just simply not giant snakes. Rarely there will be a boa that gets to be about 12 to 14 feet, and this I would say is an extra large snake. And while these animals do exist, they're at the extreme right end of the bell curve. This is truly an exceptional sized animal. I mean, we all have heard about humans that can get to be 8 or even 9 feet. I think the record height for human was 8 foot 11 inches. But of course, the average size for a human is about 5.5 feet. So you can't use these extreme examples to indicate the average size of an animal. People always love to dwell on these extreme examples, though. There's a very widely reported figure of a boa constrictor that supposedly was 18 feet. And I see this all the time, especially in the older herp literature, but even in more modern books, they cite this figure. And this is almost certainly incorrect. This was almost certainly not a boa constrictor, but it was an anaconda that was caught in Trinidad and misidentified as a boa constrictor. The largest verified size for a boa constrictor is about 13 feet or so. You know, large boa constrictors are routinely exaggerated in size, but the exaggerated sizes rarely live up to the reality. And I just wanted to show you, this is an adult Qualquay boa. This guy is maybe 4 feet long. He's not going to get much bigger than this. So this shows you this is obviously not a giant snake. This, I would say, is a kind of a medium-sized snake, no bigger than a ball python or a corn snake. The second boa constrictor myth has to do with the size of their litters. I often see in books where they claim that the average size litter for boa constrictors is somewhere around 30 or 40 babies. This is really not true. Based on my experience and talking with other locality boa keepers and breeders who've had numerous litters, the average size is closer to about 15 babies or so. And this is specifically for the locality boas, including the true red tails and the dwarf boas. These in general have somewhat smaller litters than some of the other types like the morph boas, but about 15 is typically an average size. And the range is anywhere from about 3 babies up to probably 70 or 80 babies. And there are cases of very large animals having these giant sized litters. But of course, this is by no means the norm. And just like with the size of boa constrictors, people see these extreme examples and they start thinking that that represents the norm, which it clearly does not. The third myth about boa constrictors is that they're dangerous and often result in human fatalities. And this, of course, is not true either. So I looked on the internet and looked around to try to find any cases of boa constrictor fatalities. The only thing I could find is there's a report from 2010 of a man in Nebraska who was killed supposedly by his 9 foot 25 pound red-tailed boa. I couldn't really find that much detail about this case, but it's on the internet. This is the only case of specifically a boa constrictor fatality I could find. Of course, there are some cases of other types of snakes non-venomous snakes killing people, and every few years you hear about something. Typically it involves a reticulated python or a Burmese python. You know, and while any kind of fatality due to a pet constrictor is truly a tragedy, in the grand scheme of things, other types of animals are far more fatal than constricting snakes. So this is quoted from a paper by Forrester et al., 2017. This is in the journal Wilderness and Environmental Medicine. And the title of this article is an update on fatalities due to venomous and non-venomous animals in the U.S. 2008 to 2015. So you can check out that paper if you want. But the figures that they give for the non-venomous animal category, dogs are responsible for about 34 fatalities a year, and the other mammals are responsible for 72 fatalities a year, and this includes mostly large farm animals. And then as far as non-venomous reptiles, they report less than one case of a snake, a constricting snake that kills somebody in the US per year, and less than one case of a crocodilian, an alligator or crocodile. In fact, over that period, 2008 to 2015, they report just one fatality due to a constricting snake and one due to a crocodilian. And they don't go into any more detail about the other types of mammals, but I did a little more research. And typically, the number of deaths per year in the US, if we talk about wasps and bees, they're responsible for about 50 to 60 deaths a year. Dogs, about 30. Horses, about 20. Cows and bulls, about 20. And then even pigs are responsible for about 10 deaths a year. So there's clearly lots of other animals that result in far more fatalities than constricting snakes. The number one species that kills humans are other humans. In fact, in the US, there are at least 10,000 non-negligent homicides a year, including murders. And if you include negligent homicides like accidents, drunk driving, etc., there's many times that. So humans are far, far, far more dangerous than any other animal, including, of course, snakes. The next three misconceptions have to do with the anatomy of the boa constrictor. And the first concerns its jaws. And there's this misconception that boa constrictors and other constricting snakes can actually unhinge their jaws in order to eat large prey items. And this is actually not true. The fact is that the boa constrictors and pythons have very flexible jaws that can open very wide. The mouth can open to about up to 180 degrees, which is, a very large angle. And also the jaw bones in the lower jaw have this flexible ligament between them. So they're very stretchy. And so between being able to open its jaw really wide and the flexibility of its jaw bones, boa constrictors and pythons can eat animals that are quite a few times their body diameter. Of course, it's not advisable to feed your boa constrictor any prey item that's significantly larger than its body diameter. Another myth around a boa's anatomy has to do with its hearing, and the myth is that boa constrictors are completely deaf, and this is not true. The boa constrictors and other snakes don't have any external ears, but they do have an internal eardrum, and they can actually hear low frequency sounds. The lower jaw bone actually picks up these frequencies and transmits them to the brain. So they can hear lower frequency sounds. They just can't hear higher frequency sounds, but they can hear sound frequencies that are below the human range of hearing. A final myth about the boa constrictor's anatomy has to do with how they kill their prey. So it was widely believed that boas and other constricting snakes kill their prey by suffocating it to death. So the animal squeezes the prey item so tightly that it can't expand its lungs and it suffocates. And I remember reading this all the time in books when I was a kid. But that's actually not true. There was a study that was published in the Journal of Experimental Biology by the herpetologist Scott Boback, and the paper came out in 2015, but they determined that it wasn't suffocation, but rather cutting off the circulation that leads to the death of the prey item. The boa squeezes the item, the rodent so hard, or the rodent or whatever prey item, that the blood flow is cut off and the animal dies in that manner. And this is why boas and other constrictors can kill their prey so fast. If they relied on suffocation, it would take several minutes for the prey item to die. But with circulatory arrest, you can kill a prey item, or the snake can kill a prey item, in under a minute. The seventh boa constrictor myth is something I get asked about all the time, and it has to do with the saddle markings on true red-tailed boas. So the myth is that true red-tailed boas have these peak saddles, and if it doesn't have the peak saddles, it's not a true red-tailed boa. And this is completely inaccurate. So this is a Suriname true red-tailed boa, and you can see he has really nicely peaked saddles. However, many of the Suriname and other types of true red-tailed boas do not have the peak saddles. In addition, there are many non-true red-tailed boas, including certain types of Boa imperator and Boa constrictor emerali, that do have the peak saddles. So you cannot use the shape of the saddles in order to tell if something is a true red-tail or not. This is another true red-tailed boa from Suriname, and this is actually a full sibling littermate of the animal I just showed you. So you can see this guy does not have the peak saddles, but this guy is every bit as pure of a Suriname true red-tailed boa as the male I just showed you. And interestingly, the parents of this litter had moderately peaked saddles. They weren't as sharply peaked as the first male I showed you, but they were more peaked than this animal. And so this takes us to myth number 8, which is kind of an extension, and it's that you can tell the locality of a boa just by looking at its physical characteristics. And this is really not true. And we can look at a boa, and just trying not to get away there. You can look at a boa and you can determine a guess about its locality based on its physical characteristics. And you might be able to narrow it down to certain localities, but you can't definitively tell a boa's locality without detailed locality information. You need the information of where the founder animals were collected, and you need to be able to trust the breeder that they're accurately representing their animals. So this particular animal, I know can be traced back to Suriname as far as its ancestry, but if I didn't know that and we just looked at this animal, we could tell it's a true red-tailed boa, and you could probably narrow it down to a boa, true red-tail from northern South America, from the Guiana Shield region. So it could be from Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, or maybe Brazil, but you couldn't really narrow it down any more precisely. I could with a pretty good amount of confidence, I could say that this isn't a Peruvian or a Venezuelan true red-tailed boa, but without that locality history, I can't tell it is a Suriname red-tailed boa. Myth number 9 is that boas are for advanced snake keepers only, and that people need to have previous snake experience before getting their first boa constrictor. And this is also untrue. It used to be people thought that you should start out with a starter snake, like a garter snake, then move your way up to like a king snake or some kind of a constrictor qualbrid before going into a boa constrictor. And I can say that this is kind of a very naive view. And any reptile can be kept by anyone that does their homework and research and gives it the ideal husbandry that it needs. So I would say that if you want a boa constrictor, it doesn't make sense to get another type of snake, because life is short and these animals live a very long time. So go for the boa constrictor. There are certain types of boas that are better for beginners, like this Kubsch Pastel Colombian boa. And I did a video on the best boas for beginners, so check that out if you want. But if you want to get a boa constrictor, even as your first pet snake, as long as you do your background research and you provide everything it needs, chances are you'll be highly successful. Boa constrictor myth number 10, which is the final one I'm going to discuss in this video, is one that I hear all the time, especially among beginners, and is that you should feed your boa constrictor in a separate container from its enclosure just to avoid it becoming aggressive. The mentality is that you don't want your boa constrictor to associate its home enclosure with food so that it doesn't attack you when you try to pick it up the handle. And this is not true, and it's not a good idea for several reasons. So when you're feeding your boa constrictor, it's always a good idea and highly advisable to use tongs or large tweezers or some other implement to offer the food item to the boa. You don't want to use your bare hands because boas sometimes miss the food and they get your hand. So always use some kind of implement. Your boa will associate that implement with food, and if you just try to pick up your boa with your bare hands, it's going to be less likely to try to bite. In addition, it's always a good idea not to surprise your boa, and if you're going to pick it up to handle, you should basically touch its tail end first away from its head, just to let it know that you're about to pick it up. So why is it not a good idea to feed in a separate enclosure? Well, after a boa constrictor has eaten, it's really not a good idea to handle it because you can make it more susceptible to regurgitating the food item. And if your boa has eaten in a separate container, you're going to have to pick it up to transfer it back to its cage, thus risking that it regurgitates its food item. So again, I don't recommend ever feeding in a separate enclosure. Always feed in the enclosure that your boa lives in. So there you have it. That's 10 of the top myths about boa constrictors. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot me a line. Thanks for watching and enjoy your boas.